It was late autumn in 2018 when I decided to take a short break from the noise of the city and spend a week alone in a small farm cabin my cousin had recently bought in rural Lincolnshire, England. He'd mentioned that it was a bit run down, tucked away behind a set of old wheat fields that hadn't been properly maintained in years, but I didn't care much. I just needed quiet, a place to breathe. The cabin was about a half-hour drive from the nearest village, and by the time I got there, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees, painting everything in a dull orange glow. The dirt road leading to the property was uneven, and my tires kept bumping over stones. The fields around the cabin stretched far and empty, the wheat long dead and colorless, swaying dryly in the wind like brittle bones. The cabin itself stood on a small rise, its wooden frame weathered and gray. The windows were fogged with grime, and the front steps sagged slightly when I stepped on them. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood, damp earth, and something I couldn't quite place. Maybe oil or dust. There was a narrow hallway that led to a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a sitting area with a rusted wood stove. The place looked abandoned, even though my cousin had told me he'd used it during summer for a few days. There were a few old tools leaning against the wall, a broken pitchfork, a rusted spade, and a hammer with its handle cracked in half. I unpacked my things, lit a candle since the power didn't seem to work, and sat near the stove, listening to the faint sound of wind sliding through the gaps in the window frame. That first night was quiet except for the creaking of the wood. I remember lying on the old bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, thinking about how unnerving it was to hear every tiny sound. A branch scraping the window, a mouse scurrying under the floorboards, the faint whine of the wind outside. When you live in the city, you get used to background noise, cars, people, voices. Out here, silence feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. The next morning, I went out to look around the property. The air was cold, and a thin fog hung low over the ground. Behind the cabin, there was a small barn, the roof half collapsed, and next to it a wooden fence that had been eaten away by rot. The fields stretched far in every direction, but there was a patch of soil behind the barn that looked recently disturbed. It caught my attention because everything else around was overgrown or dead, but this small area looked freshly dug, the dirt darker and softer, as if someone had been there not long ago. I thought maybe my cousin had been trying to plant something, though it didn't make much sense given the season. Later that day, I decided to take a walk around the nearby area. The land sloped down towards a narrow stream that cut through the property. On the other side were more trees, dense and colorless, their leaves all fallen. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the distant hum of a tractor or car. I walked for about an hour before heading back, and when I came up near the cabin again, I noticed something strange. One of the tools that had been leaning against the wall inside the hallway, the cracked hammer, was now lying outside near the steps. I hadn't touched it. I stood there for a few minutes, just staring at it, trying to figure out if maybe I'd kicked it accidentally earlier, but I couldn't remember. That night, the air turned colder. I lit the small stove and sat close to it, reading one of the old newspapers I'd found stuffed in a drawer. The paper was from 2009, almost a decade old, and the front page mentioned a local man who had gone missing somewhere around this area. There wasn't much detail, just that he'd been working on a nearby property and never came home. I didn't think much of it then, just another odd country story that got buried over time. At around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise coming from outside. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, a soft metallic clinking, like something tapping against metal. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound had a rhythm to it, slow and deliberate. I got up, grabbed the flashlight from my bag, and looked out the small window. The beam cut through the dark but didn't show much. The fog had rolled in thick, covering most of the yard. I couldn't see the barn or the fields anymore, just a gray wall. The sound stopped after a while, and I convinced myself it was something loose on the barn door or a branch knocking against something. But when I woke up the next morning, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt behind the cabin. They weren't mine. I hadn't gone that way, and they led straight towards that disturbed patch of soil behind the barn. I felt uneasy, like something wasn't right. I followed them carefully, and when I reached the spot, I saw that the soil looked even more freshly turned than before. Someone had definitely been digging there recently. I didn't have any phone signal out there, and I wasn't about to drive 30 minutes into the village over what might have been nothing, so I told myself I was overthinking it. Still, the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I stepped outside, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the field, a flicker of something just out of sight. Once, I thought I saw a figure standing by the tree line, but when I blinked, it was gone. That evening, I brought my dog, Rocco, who'd been mostly quiet the whole time, inside the cabin before dark. Around 9 p.m., he started growling low, staring at the front door. His ears were stiff, his body tense. I couldn't hear anything, but the way he was reacting made my skin crawl. Then, faintly, I heard it again, that same slow metallic tapping, like something hitting the side of the barn. I waited for a while, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. I grabbed the flashlight and went out. The air was colder than before, and the fog was back, thick and still. The beam of my flashlight barely reached the barn. As I got closer, the tapping stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was worse, deep and empty. I stood there for a few seconds, breathing heavily, scanning the area. That's when I noticed the barn door was slightly open. I pushed it carefully and shined the light inside. The barn smelled of damp wood and old hay. There were some rusted tools, an overturned bucket, and a pile of something covered with a torn tarp. When I stepped closer, my foot hit something hard, a shovel, lying flat on the floor. The handle was splintered, like it had been used roughly. I lifted the tarp slowly, and underneath it were old sacks of soil and a few broken boards. But what caught my eye wasn't the sacks. It was a piece of rope lying beside them, freshly cut, and a small patch of dirt that looked just like the one outside. Someone had been digging here too. I went back inside the cabin, locked the door, and didn't sleep at all that night. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something outside. The crunch of footsteps, the creak of the porch, faint rustling. But I didn't move. I just sat in the corner with the flashlight in my hand and Rocco pressed against my leg. When morning finally came, I packed everything I could, loaded it into my car, and got ready to leave. As I was about to start the engine, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Near the edge of the field, close to the spot where the soil had been disturbed, there was a shovel sticking upright in the ground, fresh mud clinging to the blade. Someone had been there that night. I didn't stay to find out who. I drove out fast, bouncing down the dirt road until the cabin disappeared behind me. When I told my cousin about it later, he seemed uneasy and said he'd go check. A week later, he called me. The police had been there. They found what had been buried behind the barn. It was a body. From what they said, it had been there for years, maybe even before my cousin bought the place. The report later said it matched the man who'd gone missing back in 2009. They never figured out who buried him there or why, but knowing that I had spent nights sleeping a few meters away from that spot still makes my skin crawl. Every sound, every strange movement I saw in the fog, it all made sense afterward. Someone had been returning to that place, maybe to check, maybe to dig again. I never went back to that farm cabin. My cousin sold it soon after. Sometimes when I drive through quiet countryside roads and see an old barn or an empty field, I think about that week. The silence, the footprints, the sound of metal in the dark, and I realize that some places hold on to the things people try to bury, no matter how much time passes. I remember that week clearer than I remember most years of my life. It was late September of 2017, somewhere near the timberline of western Montana. I had been driving alone for almost 6 hours, heading toward a small, old cabin that I'd rented online. It wasn't meant to be a vacation. I just wanted quiet, away from everyone and everything. I was 31 then, tired of the city, tired of people, and trying to figure out why I felt so uneasy with life in general. The cabin looked simple in the pictures: wood walls, tin roof, a small porch facing a lake that looked more like a large pond. By the time I reached the place, the light was fading, and the air had that sharp edge of early fall. I parked my truck beside the cabin and got out. The smell of pine was thick and damp, like rain had just passed through. The cabin stood a little crooked on its foundation, and one of the shutters hung loose. I didn't care about that. All I wanted was silence. Inside, the cabin had 2 rooms. A small kitchen connected to a living space with a wood stove, a sagging couch, and a table covered in knife marks and cigarette burns. The other room had a single bed and a small window that faced the woods. There was no signal, no electricity except a small generator outside, and no running water besides a hand pump by the porch. It felt disconnected from the world in the best way possible. The first night went fine. I unpacked my gear, lit a few candles, made some canned soup, and read until I fell asleep. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, a faint, slow scraping noise coming from somewhere outside. It stopped before I could fully get my bearings. I figured it was a branch brushing the siding or maybe an animal scratching around. I ignored it and went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked down to the lake. The air was cold enough to sting my nose, and fog rolled low over the water. Everything was still. I didn't see any houses nearby, just endless trees and slopes disappearing into gray mist. When I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something odd on the wall near the back door. Long, thin marks in the wood. They looked like they'd been made by something sharp, maybe metal. I ran my fingers along them. The grooves were fresh. I brushed it off as an animal again. There were mountain lions around that region, even bears. I told myself one of them might have scratched around during the night, but it didn't sit right with me. The marks were too straight, too deliberate. That day I stayed busy, chopped some wood, read more, walked a few miles down the old trail behind the cabin. I didn't see anyone or anything. By evening, I was tired enough to not care about the unease still sitting at the back of my mind. I cooked some beans on the small propane stove, drank a beer, and sat outside on the porch until the last bit of light disappeared behind the trees. When night came, I couldn't sleep right away. The woods made small noises, branches creaking, an occasional rustle in the brush, but it was nothing alarming. I must have drifted off around midnight, because the next thing I remember was waking again, that same scraping sound outside. Only this time, it was closer, slower, almost like someone dragging something across the porch. I froze. My heartbeat felt too loud in the stillness. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The sound moved from one end of the porch to the other. Then it stopped. After a long silence, I heard something light, soft, uneven steps, not animal-like but careful, as if someone didn't want to be heard. I didn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling while every nerve in my body screamed to do something. I told myself not to panic, not to make a sound. The steps faded after a while, but I didn't sleep again. I just lay there, staring into the dark until the first light started to creep through the window. When morning came, I went out to check the porch. The boards were damp from the night air, and there were faint smudges on them, muddy, thin, like the soles of worn boots. My stomach turned when I saw that they led right up to my door and then back down the steps toward the trees. That's when I realized someone had been there, watching, maybe even trying to get in. I walked the edge of the woods, trying to spot where the prints went, but they disappeared into the soft soil and fallen needles. I didn't see anyone around, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever it was, they hadn't gone far. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the road back was long, and I didn't want to drive the mountain pass half asleep. I decided I'd stay one more night and leave at first light. That evening, I double-checked the door lock. It was a week-old latch, but I pushed a chair under the handle for good measure. I made sure the windows were closed tight and the generator was off so the sound wouldn't drown out anything outside. I sat with my flashlight and kept it near me. The woods felt different that night. The silence wasn't calm anymore. It was heavy, waiting. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Around midnight, the scraping came again, this time right against the side wall near the kitchen. Slow, deliberate. I felt my throat tighten. It lasted for maybe a minute, then stopped. A few seconds later, I heard the faint sound of breathing outside the window. I didn't move. I just stared at the shadows flickering from the candlelight. Then something brushed against the window glass. Not a tap, not a knock, just a dragging motion like fingertips running slowly across it. I stayed like that until the sound went away. My hand was tight around the flashlight, but I didn't dare turn it on. Hours passed before the sky started to turn gray. When I finally stepped outside that morning, I noticed something new. Muddy handprints on the window. They were high, too high for a child, and smudged with dirt. The shape of them made my stomach twist. Whoever had been there had stood watching me through the glass for a long time. That was enough. I packed up everything I could fit into the truck, threw the rest into a bag, and left the place without even cleaning up. The tires kicked up dirt as I drove away, glancing in the mirror again and again, expecting to see someone standing on the porch watching me go. The nearest town was nearly an hour away. When I finally stopped for gas, I realized my hands were shaking. I told the clerk there was someone hanging around the cabins up near the lake, that maybe they should call it in. He looked at me like he wasn't surprised. He said people sometimes broke into the old cabins during off-season, living out in the woods, moving from one empty place to another. It made sense in a terrible way. Whoever that was out there, maybe they'd been living rough for a long time, watching from the tree line, taking food when they could. Maybe the cabin wasn't as rented out as I thought, and I'd ended up in someone else's hiding spot. A week later, I got a call from the rental company. They said someone had broken into the same cabin again just days after I'd left. The door was smashed open, furniture overturned. No sign of who did it, but the caretaker said it looked like whoever it was had been living there for a while before I came. He found old blankets, empty cans, and a pile of animal bones behind the shed. That confirmed it for me. I hadn't imagined any of it. Whoever was there that night had probably been watching from the woods the whole time I stayed, waiting for me to leave. I still don't know what would have happened if I'd opened that door or turned on that flashlight when I heard the breathing outside. Since then, I haven't gone back to any remote cabins. Even when I go hiking, I can't camp alone anymore. Every time the woods go quiet around me, I remember that slow scraping sound against the wall, that faint breathing outside the window, and those muddy handprints. Proof that someone was standing just inches away, watching me while I pretended to be asleep. I used to think being alone in the middle of nowhere was peaceful. Now I know better. Out there, away from everything, you're not really alone. You just don't always see what's sharing the woods with you. It was late October 2019 when I decided to drive up to an old cabin I'd rented for a week just outside a small town called La Plata in northern New Mexico. I'd been working long hours as a construction inspector in Albuquerque and needed a break from the constant noise, traffic, and city lights. The cabin sat near the edge of a dry canyon, surrounded by juniper trees and dusty hills that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It looked quiet, peaceful even, but something about the silence of that area had a heaviness to it, like the air itself was watching you. The drive there took about 5 hours, and by the time I reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was already dipping low behind the mountains. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for one vehicle, and littered with rocks and tire ruts. My truck jolted every few seconds, and I could hear gravel scraping underneath. The cabin finally came into view after a sharp turn, small, weathered wood siding, a tin roof, and a porch with one broken step. It looked like no one had stayed there in years. Inside, it was simple, one room with a small kitchen, a single bed pushed against the wall, and a wood stove. The air smelled faintly of old smoke and dust. I unloaded my gear, sleeping bag, food, tools, and a cooler, and set them down by the door. There was no cell signal, no nearby houses, and only a faint humming sound from the wind moving through the trees outside. I remember thinking how good it would feel to disconnect from everything for a while. The first night went quietly. I built a small fire outside, cooked some food, and sat under the stars. The sky was darker than anything I'd seen in years. Every sound was sharp, the crackle of wood, the rustle of brush, even the shifting of the ground beneath my chair. Around midnight, I heard something moving behind the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like footsteps. I froze, thinking maybe a coyote had wandered close. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the back, but nothing was there. The sound stopped, and I brushed it off as my imagination or maybe an animal that ran off when it saw the light. The next morning, I walked behind the cabin and saw what looked like footprints in the dirt. They were odd, longer than human prints and narrow, but still shaped like feet. They went from the tree line straight toward the cabin and stopped near the back wall. I crouched to look closer, but the ground was dry and crumbly, so it was hard to tell what exactly made them. Still, they unsettled me. That day, I hiked around the area, exploring the hills and canyon edges. The wind never seemed to stop blowing out there, always carrying dust and that dry, earthy smell of sagebrush. I didn't see anyone the entire day, which felt strange. Usually, you'd expect another hiker or maybe a truck passing by, but it was like I'd been dropped into a place that time forgot. That night, the wind picked up harder, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard what sounded like someone walking again. Slow, dragging steps, circling the cabin. My dog, Riley, who I'd brought along for company, lifted his head and started growling low. His ears were up, eyes fixed on the door. I could hear his breathing, quick and sharp, as he stood on the floorboards. I didn't move. I listened. The steps paused by the door. Then came a faint scratching sound, like nails lightly scraping against the wood. I sat there, completely still, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. After a while, the sound stopped, and everything went quiet again except for the wind. In the morning, when I stepped outside, I found more of those prints, leading from the trees to the porch. This time, they were clearer, pressed deep into the dirt. The odd thing was how uneven they looked, like whoever or whatever made them was limping. They circled the cabin once and disappeared back into the woods. By the third night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the distance when the light faded, shadows that didn't seem to match the trees. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me after being alone too long. But the prints kept appearing every morning, sometimes closer to the door. I decided to set up a motion-activated camera outside, facing the backside of the cabin. I placed it on a small tripod and aimed it where the prints usually showed up. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint sounds outside, twigs snapping, light shuffling, but I refused to go out. Riley stayed awake too, sitting near the window, ears twitching every time something moved. When daylight came, I checked the camera. The battery was dead. It had been fully charged the night before, but the screen was blank. No photos, no recordings, just dead. I thought maybe the cold drained it, but when I tried turning it on again, nothing happened. I took it inside and packed it away. That's when I noticed something strange. The door frame had deep scratches running down one side, like something tried clawing at it during the night. They were too high to be from Riley and too wide for any small animal. By then, I was tired, nervous, and starting to feel like I'd made a mistake coming here alone. I thought about leaving early, but I had 2 more days left on the rental, and it felt stupid to bail just because of some noises and footprints. Still, that night, I double-bolted the door, pulled the table against it, and kept a hammer beside my bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something heavy hitting the wall. Not a knock, a thud like a shoulder or body slamming into it. Riley barked and ran to the door. The thudding came again, harder this time, making the window rattle. Then silence. My chest felt tight, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I sat up, gripping the hammer, staring at the door. After a few minutes, I heard it again. But this time it wasn't coming from the door. It came from the roof. Slow, dragging steps across the metal. I could hear the weight shifting, creaking the boards above me. Riley barked again, frantic. Then came a sudden metallic scrape, like claws across the tin. I didn't move. I just waited, frozen, until the noise stopped. When morning finally came, I went outside and checked the roof. There were dents in the metal sheets, long and uneven, like something had crawled across it. The ground around the cabin was covered in more of those prints, hundreds of them, overlapping each other. That was the moment I decided to leave. I didn't care about the rental or the remaining days. I packed everything as fast as I could, threw it in the truck, and started down the dirt road. The whole way out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something behind me. A few miles from the cabin, near the bend in the road where the canyon began to open up, I saw something standing at the edge of the trees. It looked like a man, tall, thin, wearing torn clothes, but there was something wrong about the way it stood. Its arms hung too low, and its head tilted at a strange angle, like it wasn't used to holding it upright. It just stood there, facing the road. I drove past it, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I never looked back. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks, those sounds, that figure in the trees. A week later, I called the local ranger station to ask if they'd had reports of animals in that area. The man I spoke to said they'd had several calls over the years. People hearing things, seeing someone or something wandering near old cabins. He told me most folks called it skinwalker country, said to stay away after dark. I didn't tell him what I saw. I didn't tell anyone. Even now, years later, when I drive through quiet stretches of road at night and see the outline of trees against the sky, I still remember that feeling, the heavy silence, the dragging steps, and the way that things stood watching me as I drove away. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a story. It was real, and I knew it. It was the winter of 2017 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small wooden cabin near the edge of the Peak District in England. I had found it listed online, a secluded place owned by an older man who rented it to hikers and writers. The photos made it look peaceful, surrounded by trees, with a small stream running nearby. I wanted quiet. I had just left my job in Manchester after a stressful few months, and I needed somewhere far from people, somewhere where I could clear my head. The drive took about 3 hours. The last part of the journey was down a narrow dirt road that barely fit my car. It was lined with bare trees that looked darker than usual under the gray winter sky. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frost, and everything seemed lifeless. When I reached the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. The walls were dark, probably from years of rain, and the windows were old and foggy. Still, it felt quiet and isolated, which was what I wanted. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The owner had left a few things: an old kettle, a few books stacked on a crooked shelf, and a small oil lamp on the table. The floor creaked when I walked, and the wind outside made the window frames rattle faintly. There was a small fireplace, and I brought enough firewood to last the week. I unpacked my things, set up my sleeping bag on the old bed, and started a fire. That first night was peaceful. I made tea, sat near the fire, and read for a while. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind brushing against the trees. Around midnight, I turned off the lamp and went to sleep. It must have been around 3 a.m. when I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. I thought maybe it was the wind, but then I heard something else. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on frozen leaves. I froze in bed, listening. The sound was steady, slow, and seemed to move around the cabin. For a few seconds, it stopped. Then I heard a light scraping sound, like something brushing against the wall outside. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding. There was no electricity, so the only light came from the dying fire. I couldn't see anything through the window, just darkness. After a few minutes, everything went silent again. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a fox or a deer, and eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning, the air outside was cold and still. When I stepped out, I noticed faint footprints near the corner of the cabin. They were human, small, narrow footprints that led from the trees toward the back window and then disappeared behind the shed. I felt uneasy, but I tried not to overthink it. Maybe someone had passed by the cabin earlier, or maybe they were old prints from before I arrived. The day went by quietly. I went for a walk along the trail near the stream and collected some firewood. The forest was empty, not a single person in sight. By the time I got back, the sun was already setting. I cooked a simple meal, ate quietly, and tried to read again. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there. That night, I made sure to lock the door and place a chair under the handle. I kept the lamp burning low beside the bed. Around midnight, I heard it again. The same crunching footsteps, slow and steady, circling the cabin. My hands were shaking as I sat up, staring at the window. The fire had burned down to red embers. The sound moved closer to the front of the cabin, then stopped. I listened for what felt like an hour, barely breathing. Nothing happened. No knock, no voice, no movement. I didn't sleep much that night. When daylight finally came, I went outside to check. More footprints. They were fresh this time, pressed clearly into the frost. They circled the cabin once, stopped by the front steps, then disappeared toward the trees again. I walked a bit down the path to see if I could find where they led, but they just faded after a few meters where the ground was harder. By now, I was on edge. There wasn't supposed to be anyone for miles. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I still had 2 days left, and part of me felt foolish. Maybe it was someone local, a hunter or a hiker passing through. I told myself that, even though something about the small footprints didn't feel right. That evening, I kept the lamp and fire going bright. I stayed up later, trying to distract myself by writing in a notebook. Around 1 a.m., I heard a faint tapping sound from the back wall, then another, slightly louder. It was too deliberate to be the wind. I stood up slowly and looked toward the back window. The glass was fogged from the inside, but there was a faint shadow on the other side. Someone was standing there. The figure was still, completely still. I could barely make out the shape, a person, small, possibly a woman. Her face wasn't clear, but her outline was visible against the faint light outside. I just stood there, frozen, staring at her. After a few seconds, she moved, slowly, stepping back into the dark. I didn't move for a long time. My chest felt tight, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I finally grabbed my flashlight, switched it on, and ran outside. The air hit me like ice. I shined the light around the cabin, through the trees, but there was nothing, just the wind and the sound of branches creaking. Then I turned the beam toward the ground near the window. More footprints, smaller this time, like she had been standing barefoot on the frost. I went back inside, locked the door again, and stayed awake until dawn. When morning came, I packed my things. I couldn't stay another night. As I loaded my car, I noticed something strange on the side of the cabin near the window. A smear on the wood, faint but visible. It looked like a handprint, pale against the dark wall. The fingers were long, almost unnaturally thin, but it wasn't what scared me most. Near the edge of the cabin, half covered by leaves, was a piece of torn fabric, a bit of an old gray coat. It looked worn and dirty, like it had been dragged through the woods for a long time. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she just stood there, silent, watching. I kept checking the mirror for miles, expecting to see her walking along the road. Later that evening, after I reached home, I decided to look up the area online. There wasn't much information about that part of the woods, just a few hiking reviews and old photos. But buried in a local forum, I found a thread from years ago. People talking about an abandoned cottage nearby, where an older woman had lived alone until she went missing sometime in the late 1990s. They said she was strange, often seen walking through the woods at night, collecting things from old campsites and cabins. Some claimed she'd been seen long after she disappeared, wandering through the trees, though no one could ever prove it. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. Maybe it was just a story, something locals made up to scare visitors. But when I thought about those footprints, small, bare, and fresh in the frost, it didn't feel like a story. A week later, I got an email from the cabin owner. He asked how my stay was and mentioned that if I wanted to come again, I should let him know early since he didn't rent it out much anymore. At the end of the message, he added one last line that made my stomach turn. Asterisk, you were lucky the weather stayed calm. The last few guests left early because someone kept walking around the cabin at night. Locals say it's just some old woman who lives out there, but no one's actually seen her up close in years. Asterisk, I never replied. I deleted the email and never went back to that cabin again. But sometimes, especially on cold nights when the wind scratches against the windows, I still think about that figure standing in the dark, silent, unmoving, watching me from the other side of the glass. It was October 2014, deep in the northern woods of Montana, a few miles away from a forgotten highway where no one stopped anymore. I was part of a small tactical unit from the county sheriff's department. We weren't the kind of team that got called in for normal stuff. Our job was to handle the quiet, ugly cases that didn't make it to the evening news. Most people would never know we existed. That night, we were sent out for what the report called a suspected drug operation, hidden in an old cabin up in the timberline, about 10 miles past the last service road. The briefing was thin. A local hunter had reported seeing strange activity near an old cabin that hadn't been used in decades. Lights flickering at night, cars driving in and out without plates, and trash piles hidden under leaves. The higher-ups thought it was a meth lab or something similar. We were told to go in quietly, confirm what was going on, and wait for backup before making contact. It sounded like a basic recon mission. It didn't feel like one, though. I had this weight in my gut the entire drive there. We left the patrol SUVs on the gravel road and continued in a beat-up truck that didn't look official. The woods grew darker as we climbed. It was already past 2 a.m. when we stopped. The moonlight barely cut through the clouds. The ground was soft from earlier rain, and every step felt like it sank a little deeper. There was no sound except the occasional snap of branches. Even the insects were quiet up there. We hiked for about half an hour before we saw it, the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, tilted slightly like the earth had tried to swallow it halfway. The wood was black from age, and the roof sagged near the middle. A single orange light leaked through a boarded window. It wasn't a normal bulb. It looked dim, maybe a lantern. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but there were fresh tire tracks leading up to it, cutting through the mud. We circled wide through the trees using our thermal scopes. 2 heat signatures inside, one sitting, one pacing. There was also a faint third spot behind the cabin, smaller and colder. Maybe an animal, we thought. We were trained to trust what we saw, not what we felt, but something about that place made everyone move slower than usual. I was second in the line when we reached the edge of the clearing. We stayed low, our rifles angled but not raised yet. The plan was simple. Observe, photograph, mark the coordinates, then pull back and report. But as we were setting up, we caught the smell. Chemical, sharp, like burnt plastic and cleaning solvent mixed together. Meth lab for sure. The kind that could explode if someone sneezed wrong. We could hear faint scraping from inside, metal on metal. Then something dropped, a can maybe, and the pacing stopped. The lantern light flickered. Nobody moved for almost a minute. Then the pacing started again, slower. We split. I took the right flank toward a side window, half buried under a sheet of tin. I pushed a hole through the grime with my glove and looked in. What I saw didn't match what we expected. The man pacing wasn't cooking anything. He was wearing a stained parka, and there was something spread out on the table in front of him. Papers, maps, maybe photographs, it was hard to tell. On the far side of the room, the sitting figure wasn't moving at all. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his head was tilted back, mouth open slightly. I thought he was asleep or passed out. Then I saw the dark shape on the floor near his boots. A pool. It wasn't shadow. I signaled to the team 2 fingers down, meaning 1 suspect, 1 possible fatality. We needed to enter. The door was half off its hinges, so we slipped in quietly. The wood groaned under my boots, and the man at the table turned his head fast. For a split second, he froze like he'd been expecting something but didn't know from which direction it would come. Then he bolted toward the back of the cabin. We moved in, careful not to knock anything over. The sitting man was dead. His eyes were open but glassy. His skin was pale, waxy. He looked like he'd been there at least a day. The dark pool beneath him was mostly dried blood, thick and sticky. The air inside was heavy with chemicals and something else, like rotting meat mixed with mold. The walls were covered in old newspapers and nailed up plastic sheets. Some of the articles were about missing persons, all from nearby towns. None newer than 2011. I followed the sound of boots hitting the floorboards behind the cabin. The suspect was gone. We found the back door hanging open, leading into the trees. I went after him, flashlight off, moving slow. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my helmet. I found fresh tracks leading down a narrow slope. They stopped at a half-collapsed shed about 20 yards away. The door was shut, but a faint sound came from inside. A muffled thump, like someone moving something heavy. I approached and pushed it open slowly. The smell hit first. It was worse than anything in the cabin, thick, sweet, and rotten. Inside were large plastic barrels with black garbage bags tied over the tops. I don't know why I did it, but I lifted one just slightly. Beneath it were pieces of clothing, soaked and stiff. Not trash, not chemicals, something human. We called it in immediately. The backup arrived after 40 minutes that felt like days. By then, the suspect was gone. They brought dogs, drones, everything. Nothing. It was like he vanished into the woods. When daylight came, we searched the cabin again. The maps on the table were marked with circles, remote spots all over the county. Some of them were near old hunting cabins, others near creeks or back roads. Each circle had a number next to it, 11 in total. In the following weeks, forensics dug through that site. What they found still sits in my mind like a shadow burned into my vision. Inside the barrels were remains, parts not whole. DNA matched at least 3 missing persons from the last few years. All of them had disappeared without connection until now. The local sheriff tried to keep it quiet, but word spread anyway. Reporters called it the cabin case. They never caught the man. The case went cold after 8 months. There was never another sighting, no new leads. Just one strange thing. Every few months, someone hiking out near that same forest would report seeing an old man sitting alone near the tree line, sometimes just watching the road, never moving until you got close. Then he'd be gone. I left the department a year after that night. I told myself it was because I wanted to move somewhere quieter, closer to family. But that wasn't the truth. The truth is, I couldn't shake that smell or the sight of that cabin under the moonlight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blood on the floorboards, the empty chair beside it, and the open door leading into the dark. Sometimes, when I drive alone at night, I still catch myself checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights behind me on an empty stretch of road. I never do, but I still think about that man, the one who ran into the woods. He knew we were coming. He was too calm for it to be panic. It felt like he'd done it before, like we were just another group to walk into his trap too late. That cabin's gone now. They burned it down after the investigation ended, said it was unsafe. But fire doesn't erase everything. There's still a black patch of earth where it stood. I went back once, 2 years later, just to see it in daylight. It looked peaceful, almost beautiful with the tall grass and the wind moving through it. But standing there, I could still smell that faint trace of chemicals and rot. I never told anyone, but before I left that day, I walked around the site one last time. On the far edge, where the trees start again, I saw something carved into the bark of a pine. It was small, almost hidden, just a number, 12. That's when I knew he wasn't done. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. I had rented the place from an older man I found through a newspaper ad. He said the cabin was old but functional, perfect for someone who wanted peace and quiet. That was exactly what I was looking for back then. Silence. I had quit my job at a hardware store in Billings 2 weeks before, packed up my truck, and told myself I needed time away from everything. The drive to the cabin took most of the day. The paved road turned into gravel after an hour, and then dirt after another. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. The trees grew denser, the air felt cooler, and the only sounds were from my tires grinding over rocks and the steady hum of the engine. The directions were written on a piece of paper, with landmarks like Old Gas Station Sign and Fallen Pine by the Split Trail. It was that kind of remote. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was low behind the tree line. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for a long time. The roof sagged slightly, the windows were clouded, and there were weeds growing along the wooden steps. The silence out there felt heavier than I expected. No cars, no voices, just the sound of distant wind brushing through trees. I unlocked the door, and the smell of old wood and dust hit me right away. The air inside was dry and still. The cabin was small. One room with a cot, a wood stove, a table, and a few shelves nailed to the wall. There was a small back door that led to an outhouse about 50 yards behind the cabin. The place didn't have electricity, just an old oil lamp and some candles. I unpacked my things slowly, organizing them just to keep my hands busy. My dog, Scout, followed me around as I checked every corner of the place. He was a brown and black mix, half shepherd, half something else, and he didn't seem to like the cabin much. His ears twitched constantly, and he kept glancing at the windows like he expected something to move outside. The first night went quietly. I cooked canned beans on a small camp stove and ate while sitting on the porch, listening to the forest. It was the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own breathing. The stars were bright, clearer than I'd ever seen, and the air had that cool, sharp smell that only mountain woods have at night. I fell asleep early with Scout curled up at my feet, and for a while, everything felt peaceful. The next day, I walked the trails behind the cabin. I wanted to explore to see how isolated I really was. About a mile into the woods, I found what looked like the remains of another cabin. The roof had caved in, the logs were gray and covered in moss, and rusted tools were half buried in the dirt. There was a broken axe head near a tree stump, and something about it made me feel uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like the sense that someone had left in a hurry, like everything had just been dropped and forgotten. I didn't stay long. That night, the quiet changed. It wasn't just peaceful anymore. It felt like something was missing, or like something else was listening. Scout wouldn't settle down. He paced the floor, sniffing at the door, whining softly every few minutes. Around midnight, I heard what I thought was movement outside, faint but distinct. It sounded like footsteps on dry leaves, moving slowly around the side of the cabin. I held my breath, trying to listen harder. The noise stopped, and I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I couldn't sleep for hours after that. The following morning, I found tracks near the porch. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like boot prints, deep in the dirt, leading from the edge of the tree line straight to the steps, then back into the woods. The soil there was soft from rain the day before, so the impressions were fresh, probably made during the night. I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't seen a single person since I'd arrived. Whoever had been there knew where I was. I tried to shake it off by keeping busy. I chopped wood, cleaned the place, and hiked again that afternoon, but the feeling didn't leave. I kept glancing behind me, listening for any sounds out of place. Scout stayed close, sticking right to my leg. Around sunset, I noticed something else. A thin trail of smoke far off between the trees, maybe a mile away. I stared at it for a long time. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here, not this deep. That night, I locked the door and pushed a chair under the handle, even though it was probably useless. Scout lay by the door, growling low every now and then. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound like something scraping along the side of the cabin. Not hard, just a slow, dragging scrape like someone running a stick along the wall. My throat went dry instantly. I sat up, listening, frozen in the dark. The sound stopped after maybe 10 seconds. Then there was a soft thump, like a footstep on the porch. Scout started barking like mad, his nails scraping on the floor as he lunged toward the door. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the flashlight I kept beside the bed. After a few seconds, the barking stopped, and everything went silent again. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night, but I didn't sleep either. In the morning, I went outside to look. There were more boot prints, this time closer to the cabin, circling it. I followed them into the woods for about 50 yards before I lost them. Whoever it was, they had been watching. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. By the 5th day, I had made up my mind to leave early. The peace I came for was gone, replaced by a kind of quiet that made me anxious all the time. I packed most of my things into the truck before sunset, planning to leave first thing in the morning. But that night turned out to be worse than any before. It started again with the footsteps, slow and steady, circling the cabin. Scout went wild, barking and growling, slamming his body against the door. Then came a loud knock, just one, hard enough to make the wood shake. My heart was pounding so fast I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The knock came again, slower this time, like whoever it was wanted me to know they weren't leaving. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours. Eventually, I heard the footsteps move away into the woods. I waited another half hour before I even breathed normally again. When the sun finally rose, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my last few things, loaded Scout into the truck, and got out of there. As I was backing out of the clearing, I noticed something nailed to one of the trees near the edge of the property. It was an old wooden sign, barely hanging on by a single rusted nail. The paint was faded, but I could still read what was carved into it. It said, "Private land, keep out." I didn't remember seeing it when I arrived. The drive back felt twice as long as before. The trees seemed to close in on both sides, the dirt road narrower than I remembered. Every now and then, I'd glance in the mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just empty forest stretching for miles. When I got back to the nearest small town, a place called Red Creek, I stopped at the only gas station there to fill up. I mentioned the cabin to the clerk while paying, saying I had rented it from an older man who posted the ad. He looked confused and said there hadn't been any cabins for rent out that way in years. The land had been owned by a family who left decades ago after their son went missing out there. I didn't say anything else. I just nodded, got back in the truck, and kept driving. I've never gone back to Montana since then. Sometimes, though, I wake up in the middle of the night and think about that sound. The slow scraping on the wall, the single knock on the door. I can still picture those footprints circling the cabin, the smoke rising in the distance, and that sign nailed to the tree. It wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural that scared me out there. It was something worse. The thought that someone had been watching me the entire time, walking the same trails I did, standing just far enough into the woods to see the light from my window. And whoever it was, they had been there long before I arrived and probably long after I left. It was the middle of October, the kind of season when the woods start to look half dead, when the air turns thin and smells like wet leaves and old earth. I hadn't been to my grandma's cabin in years. She passed away in 2011, and after the funeral, nobody really went back there. My uncle said it was too far out, too much trouble to maintain, but I knew the truth. No one wanted to go because of how isolated it was. The cabin sat deep in the forest, miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by tall pine trees that made it feel like time just stopped out there. I drove there one weekend in late afternoon, my dog Rusty sitting in the passenger seat. He's a big brown shepherd mix, calm most of the time but protective when something feels off. I wanted to clean the place up a little, maybe sort through my grandma's old things before the winter. The place hadn't been touched in years, and I figured it was about time someone took care of it. The dirt road leading up to the cabin looked worse than I remembered. Weeds had grown up through the gravel, and the edges were soft from years of rain washing away the soil. Branches scraped against the sides of my truck as I drove, and by the time I pulled into the clearing, the sun was already sinking low behind the trees. The cabin looked exactly how I remembered it. Small, one-story, made from weathered logs with a rusty tin roof. The windows were dusty, and the porch boards looked warped from water damage. When I stepped out, the air was cold and still. Rusty jumped out right after me, sniffing the ground and the porch steps like he could still smell something familiar. I unlocked the front door with the old key my mom had kept in a kitchen drawer, and the hinges let out a slow creak as I pushed it open. The smell hit me right away. Musty, stale, a mix of dust and something faintly sour, like mold and old wood. Inside, everything was frozen in time. The same floral curtains hung crookedly in the windows. The same framed photos of my grandma and grandpa sat on the mantel, their colors faded from sun exposure. The couch was covered with a white sheet that was more gray than white now, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. The place looked like nobody had lived there for years, but it also looked like someone could have just stepped out for a walk and never come back. I started going through the main room, folding the sheets, sweeping the floor, just to make it feel less abandoned. Rusty followed me around, sniffing everything, occasionally stopping to listen at noises outside. Maybe just squirrels or birds moving through the trees. As the evening got darker, I decided to check the back room, which used to be my grandma's storage space. I remembered she used to keep all kinds of things in there. Old quilts, boxes of magazines, gardening tools, even some canned food she made years before she passed. The door was a little stuck, so I had to shove it open. The smell inside was worse, damp and old, like something had been sitting too long without air. The room was cluttered, full of boxes stacked halfway up the wall. Dust hung in the air like smoke, and when I stepped inside, the floor creaked under my boots. I set my flashlight on top of a crate and started looking around. There were mason jars with faded labels, a couple of broken chairs, and an old chest against the far wall. It looked familiar, but I didn't remember it being locked before. The metal latch was rusted shut, but I found a small hammer in one of the toolboxes and managed to break it loose. When I lifted the lid, a puff of cold, stale air came out, like the smell of rot that's been trapped for too long. Inside, I saw old clothes, folded neatly but darkened with age. Sweaters, scarves, a few dresses I recognized from old photos of my grandma. But underneath them, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. There was a piece of fabric that looked different. Not clothes, but more like a sheet, stiff and brownish around the edges. The smell hit me before I even lifted it all the way. It was that deep, sour smell of decay that no one forgets once they've smelled it. I froze for a second. My hand shook as I pulled the rest of the cloth back, and that's when I saw it, what was left of a body. It didn't look fresh, not by years. The bones were discolored, bits of fabric still clinging to them, and parts of the skull were visible under what looked like dried, sunken skin. My first thought was that maybe it was some kind of animal, but the shape was too clear. The bones were human. I stumbled backward, hit the wall behind me, and almost dropped the flashlight. Rusty barked once, loud, sharp, then went silent, staring into the box with his ears low. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I backed out of the room and tried to steady myself, but my mind was spinning. There had never been any talk about anyone missing from our family. My grandma lived alone after my grandpa died. She didn't have visitors, not that I knew of. I went back in after a few minutes, forcing myself to look again. The body, or what was left of it, was small. The hands looked fragile. The clothes were old-fashioned, like something from the 80s maybe. I noticed something shiny near the side. A ring, simple gold with a flat top. That's when I remembered seeing that same ring in an old photo my mom once showed me. My grandma's brother, Uncle Frank. He disappeared in 1986. The family said he left town after some argument about property money. My grandma never spoke about it much, just said he moved away and lost contact. But now, looking at that body in the chest, I felt like I knew what really happened. I couldn't make sense of it. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe they fought, maybe something went wrong, and she panicked. The chest looked old enough to have been there for decades. The floor underneath it was stained darker, maybe from water or maybe from something else. I sat down on the porch steps for a while, trying to calm down. The woods were quiet except for the wind moving through the branches. I didn't want to stay the night anymore, but it was already too dark to drive back safely. I locked the door to that back room and set up a small lamp in the main room. Rusty stayed close, restless and alert. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside, the wind, the shifting boards, made me think about that chest and what was inside it. Around midnight, Rusty growled low, staring toward the back hallway, and I just sat there with the flashlight in my hand until morning. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my stuff and drove to the nearest town. I went straight to the sheriff's office and told them everything. They didn't believe me at first, but when they sent a deputy out there, they found exactly what I described. The remains were taken in, and after some weeks, they confirmed what I already suspected. The body was Uncle Frank. Turns out he never left. There was an old police record showing that he was last seen visiting my grandma's cabin the night he disappeared. No one ever thought to search the property that closely. The coroner said he likely died from blunt trauma to the head. The case was reopened, but there wasn't much to do. My grandma had been dead for more than a decade. I haven't gone back to that cabin since. The county eventually claimed the property after the investigation, and I heard they planned to demolish it. Sometimes when I think about her, the sweet, quiet woman who always smelled like soap and cinnamon, I can't fit that image with the thought of what she might have done. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it wasn't. But what stays with me most is that smell. The thick, heavy scent of decay trapped under old clothes, and how long it stayed in my nose even after I left. Rusty still gets uneasy whenever we drive through wooded areas. And every time I see an old chest or smell old wood, it brings me back to that moment in the back room. Lifting the lid and realizing the past never really stays buried. That cabin used to feel like a safe place, full of childhood memories and warmth. Now, whenever I think about it, all I can see is the dust, the stillness, and the hidden truth that waited there for decades, right under my grandmother's roof. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to drive up to my uncle's old cabin in northern Minnesota. I was 32 at the time, and my life in Minneapolis had been falling apart piece by piece. Work stress, a recent breakup, and a constant restlessness that made it hard to even sleep at night. I remembered that old cabin from when I was younger. My uncle used to take me there for fishing trips in the summers. After he passed away a few years earlier, the cabin just sat empty. No one in the family really cared to go back there. But I wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city and just clear my head. It was a 6-hour drive from where I lived. The first few hours went by easily. Open roads, gas stations, and dull gray skies. But the closer I got, the fewer cars I saw. The highway turned into long, empty roads, then cracked back roads surrounded by forests so thick I couldn't see 10 feet past the trees. The air grew colder too, sharp and damp, and the sky stayed overcast the whole time. By the time I pulled up to the narrow dirt path that led toward the cabin, it was already late afternoon. The cabin sat about 2 miles down that dirt track, hidden behind a wall of pine and birch trees. I remembered that road being rough, but I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. My tires kicked up mud and gravel as I drove through the uneven path, branches scraping against the side of the car. I saw no signs of life out there. No other cabins, no houses, not even tire tracks. Just that endless forest swallowing everything around it. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked almost the same as I remembered, only older, more worn down. The paint was chipped and gray, the porch sagged slightly on one side, and the windows were fogged from the inside. There was a detached shed a few yards away, the door barely hanging on by one hinge. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and stood there for a moment just listening. There was no sound at all, not even birds, only the faint rustle of wind moving through the trees. Inside, it smelled like dust, old wood, and dampness. The floorboards creaked with every step. There were cobwebs in the corners, and the furniture was covered with a thin layer of dust. I set my bag down, opened one of the windows to let in some air, and checked the place over. The kitchen still had the same metal sink and cracked tile countertop. The fridge was empty but still worked when I plugged in the generator outside. I brought enough food for a few days, canned beans, bread, coffee, and a few bottles of water. That first evening, I tried to settle in. I lit a small fire in the old brick fireplace, heated up a can of soup, and sat down in one of the wooden chairs near the window. The forest outside looked darker than I remembered. When the sun went down, it disappeared completely. No moonlight, no nearby cabins with lights, just solid black. I thought it would be peaceful, but that kind of silence was different. It wasn't calm, felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on the cabin. I went to bed early that night, around 9, wrapped in 2 blankets because the air was freezing. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but the fire had burned out and the room was pitch black. I lay there listening, trying to figure out what woke me. Then I heard it. A faint thumping sound, dull and slow, coming from somewhere outside. It wasn't an animal. It was steady, like footsteps on wood. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch hitting the roof, but the sound moved. It went from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. My heart was beating hard, but I stayed still, trying to convince myself it was nothing. After a while, it started again, this time closer, right outside the wall near where I was sleeping. 3 slow thumps, then silence. I sat up, trying to see through the window, but it was too dark. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing. Then, just when I thought it had stopped, something hit the side of the cabin again. Louder this time. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the flashlight from the table, and shined it out the window. The beam caught the trees, the old shed, and part of the clearing around the cabin. Nothing moved. I didn't go outside. I just stood there, staring through the glass until my arms started shaking from how tightly I was holding the flashlight. After a while, I sat back on the bed and stayed awake until morning. The next day, I walked around the cabin to see if anything was there. In the soft mud near the porch, I saw what looked like footprints, but they weren't clear. The mud was too uneven. They looked like someone had walked there recently, maybe barefoot or in socks. The tracks led toward the back of the shed and stopped near a patch of overgrown weeds. I opened the shed door slowly, creaked loud enough to make my skin crawl. Inside, it smelled like old gasoline and rotting wood. There were a few rusted tools, a broken fishing rod, and some old nails scattered across the floor. In the corner, under a torn tarp, something caught my eye, a dark shape about the size of a person curled up. I froze for a few seconds before I finally pulled the tarp away. It wasn't a person, not anymore. It was a body, or what was left of one. Mostly bones, a few scraps of clothing still hanging off it. I backed up so fast I hit the wall. The air felt thick in my throat. The clothes were torn but looked like old work jeans and a flannel shirt. I couldn't tell how long the body had been there, but it wasn't fresh. Months, maybe even a year. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't look like it had been buried, just left there under that tarp, like whoever put it there didn't care if it was found. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and sat down. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I didn't have phone service that far out, and the nearest town was miles away. The thought of walking that far through the woods didn't feel safe either. I told myself I'd drive back first thing in the morning. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my flashlight and my hunting knife beside me, listening. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. The same dull thumping, only this time slower, heavier, came from behind the shed, exactly where I'd found the body. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the knife, staring at the dark window. The noise stopped for a long time, then started again, moving closer toward the porch. My breath came in short bursts. Then I heard a sharp crack, like wood splitting, and the sound of something dragging across the ground. I stood up and turned off the light, trying to hear where it was coming from. After a few minutes, everything went quiet again. At dawn, I packed everything into my car. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just got in and drove, fast, barely staying on the muddy path. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop until I got to a gas station about 20 miles away. I called the sheriff's office and told them what I'd found in the shed. They told me to stay put. Later that afternoon, a deputy met me there. I followed them back to the cabin while they checked everything. They didn't say much, but I saw their faces when they came out of the shed, serious, pale. They confirmed it was a human body, likely male. A few days later, I got a call saying it was identified as a missing local man from 2 years earlier. They thought he might have gotten lost out there or met someone who didn't want him found. I never went back to that cabin again. It was sold off the following year. But sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I still hear that slow, heavy sound against the walls. The sound that started long before I knew there was someone buried just a few feet away from where I slept. That was the last time I ever went looking for peace in the middle of nowhere. It was late October of 2016 when I got assigned to a small ranger outpost deep inside the Bitter Creek Reserve in northern Montana. I was 34 at the time, and I had been working as a park ranger for a little over 5 years. The main station was about an hour's drive from the small wooden cabin where I'd be staying for the next few weeks. The outpost was meant for overnight patrols and weather monitoring, pretty simple work, but the isolation was something most rangers avoided. I didn't mind the quiet, or at least I thought I didn't. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt path that wound through miles of dense pine forest. The road hadn't been maintained in years. The tires kicked up rocks, mud, and dead needles as I drove up. The sky was already turning gray when I arrived, the kind of thick, overcast sky that looks like it's been holding back rain all day. The air was cold and heavy, and the wind carried the smell of wet pine and earth. The cabin itself was small, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a tin roof and a single window on each side. The wood was old, cracked, and dark from years of weather. The front porch sagged a little, and one of the steps creaked badly when I stepped on it. Inside, it smelled like dust, damp wood, and stale air. The main room had a small table, a wood stove, a cot against the wall, and a cabinet full of old field maps, canned food, and basic tools. There was no power except for a small generator out back that ran on gasoline. By the time I unpacked my gear, it had started to drizzle. I could hear the soft patter of rain hitting the roof, steady and calm. I set up a small radio on the table and tuned it to the Ranger channel, just in case I needed to check in with the main station. The signal was weak, full of static, but it was enough to hear the occasional weather update or emergency call. That first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I could hear the rain on the roof and the occasional rustle of the forest outside. I stayed awake for a while, just listening. The silence out there has a weight to it, like it's pressing against you. When I finally managed to fall asleep, I woke up once in the middle of the night to what sounded like heavy steps outside the cabin, slow and steady, moving around the perimeter. I sat up in bed, listening carefully. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was probably an elk or a bear wandering close by. Still, I reached for my flashlight and waited in the dark until the sound of rain returned. The next morning, the air was cold enough to see my breath. I stepped outside and looked around the clearing. The ground was muddy from the rain, and there were prints near the edge of the trees. Deep, wide impressions that didn't quite look like deer or bear tracks. They were spaced far apart, like something large had taken long strides. I crouched down to look closer, but the rain had already blurred the outlines. I couldn't tell what made them, and I didn't think too much of it. Most of the day went by quietly. I hiked a few trails, checked the fire towers, and noted fallen branches blocking some paths. The woods felt endless. Every direction looked the same. Tall pines, patches of fog, and damp moss covering everything. There were moments where I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't explain why. just an uneasy sense, like the trees themselves were holding something still inside them. When I returned to the cabin that evening, the rain started again, heavier this time. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the window frame. I filled the generator and started it up, its low hum filling the cabin. I cooked a simple meal from a can and tried to read one of the old ranger logs left behind in the drawer. Some of the entries dated back to the early 2000s, mostly about animal sightings, weather patterns, and trail maintenance. But a few of them were strange, short notes about odd noises and tracks by the East Ridge. One entry mentioned tools going missing from the shed behind the cabin. That night, the sound of the rain mixed with something else, a faint metallic clanging coming from outside. It was steady at first, then stopped suddenly. I turned off the generator to listen more clearly. The forest was completely dark, the kind of black where you can't see your hand in front of your face. Then I heard the sound again, closer this time, like metal brushing against metal. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beam of light cut through the rain, illuminating the wet ground and the edge of the clearing. I moved slowly toward the small tool shed a few yards behind the cabin. The door was swinging open, tapping against the frame in the wind. The padlock was hanging loose. It looked like it had been broken clean off. Inside, some of the tools were missing: a shovel, a hatchet, a fuel can. I scanned the ground, my light catching something near the tree line, a flash of red. When I walked closer, I saw it was one of the old fuel cans, half empty and lying on its side. There were footprints around it, deep and fresh. The size of the prints bothered me. They were from boots, not animal tracks. Someone had been there. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat by the window, watching the tree line through the rain. Every few minutes I'd think I saw movement, but it was hard to tell if it was real or just the rain playing tricks on my eyes. Around midnight, the generator sputtered and died. I didn't bother restarting it. The silence was unnerving. In the morning, I decided to radio the main station, but the signal was too weak. All I got was static. I figured I'd wait it out and report it when the weather cleared. Still, the broken padlock kept bothering me. I spent the day walking the area again, looking for signs of anyone nearby. I didn't find much, just faint boot prints heading deeper into the forest, disappearing into the mud and leaves. That evening, the rain came back harder than before. Thunder rolled through the valley, and the whole cabin shook with every gust of wind. I secured the doors and windows as best I could, then sat near the stove with my flashlight. Sometime after midnight, I heard something again. Slow, deliberate steps on the porch. Not an animal. Too heavy. The wood creaked under the weight. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The steps stopped right outside the door. Then I heard a faint scraping sound, metal against wood, like something being dragged across the doorframe. I sat there, not moving, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. The next thing I heard was the rain, nothing else. I didn't move until the first light of dawn came through the window. When I finally opened the door, the first thing I saw was the shovel, leaned up against the wall next to the door. The handle was wet, and there was dirt caked on the blade. Fresh dirt. I looked around the clearing. About 20 feet away, near the edge of the trees, there was a patch of freshly turned soil, dark and uneven. My stomach tightened. I walked over to it slowly. The ground was soft, recently dug up. I kicked at the dirt with my boot, and the smell hit me. A strong, earthy, sour smell. Something had been buried there recently. I didn't dig deeper. I didn't want to. I packed my gear, loaded it into the truck, and left the cabin without looking back. The road was rough and slick with mud, and it took nearly an hour to reach the main station. When I finally got a signal, I reported the break-in and what I found near the cabin. 2 officers went up later that afternoon to check it out. They came back quiet. One of them told me they found the shovel, the broken lock, and the disturbed ground. They said they'd send a team to investigate further. I never went back to that outpost again. A week later, I got a call from one of the senior rangers. He told me they dug up the area behind the cabin. What they found was a shallow grave, an old one by the look of it. A man's remains, half buried, with fragments of a ranger's uniform still visible. No ID, no clear cause of death. They think he might have been a ranger who went missing nearly 20 years earlier. I don't know who was out there those nights, or why they broke into the shed, or what they were digging for. But I still remember the sound of those steps on the porch, heavy and slow, right outside the door. Every time it rains now, I can still hear that sound in my head, the soft creak of wet wood under a stranger's boots. It was late October 2019 when I decided to take a short break from everything and drive out to a small cabin I'd rented near the edge of a forest in northern Montana. I had been working long hours that entire year, and I just needed to get away from people, traffic, and noise. I wanted to spend a few quiet days surrounded by trees and cold air. I brought my dog, Milo, a big brown Labrador who always seemed happier in the woods than anywhere else. He was calm, loyal, and never barked unless something really bothered him. The cabin was old but sturdy. It sat a few miles off a dirt road that twisted through thick pine trees. The place had one small bedroom, a kitchen, and a narrow porch that faced a valley. There was no signal out there, no internet, and barely any power. The lights flickered if I ran the heater for too long. I liked that, though. It felt separate from everything, like time slowed down a little. The first 2 days were calm. During the day, I hiked through the woods with Milo, following trails that wound past small frozen creeks. The ground was covered in layers of dead pine needles, soft and damp beneath my boots. At night, I made simple meals, canned soup, bread, and coffee, and sat by the small wood stove while Milo lay by my feet. I remember the quiet being so deep that I could hear the slow cracking of the firewood and the faint wind pressing against the windows. On the third night, it started to rain. The sound on the roof was steady and heavy. I had planned to leave the next morning, but something about the storm made me decide to stay one more night. I thought it would be nice to watch the rain and sleep in late. Around 9 p.m., the power flickered again and then went completely out. The only light came from the small lantern I kept on the table. I wasn't worried at first. The cabin's owner had warned me the power cut out sometimes during storms. I sat by the window for a while, just watching the outlines of the trees swaying in the darkness. Milo had been asleep, but he suddenly lifted his head. His ears perked up, and his eyes moved toward the door. I listened carefully but heard nothing beyond the rain. Then, after a few minutes, I heard something faint outside, like the crunch of wet leaves. Not footsteps exactly, just movement. I tried to tell myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon. Milo stood up, tail stiff, staring toward the door. I lit another candle and went to check. When I stepped onto the porch, the cold air hit me sharply. It was pitch dark except for the faint light of the lantern through the window behind me. I could smell the damp earth and the pine trees soaked from the rain. The forest was quiet, except for that distant dripping sound, rain falling off the branches. I stayed there for a moment, looking out, but saw nothing. I went back inside and shut the door firmly. Milo kept staring at it for a while before finally lying back down, though his head stayed raised. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound felt louder than usual. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to Milo growling quietly. It was a deep sound, low in his throat. I sat up slowly. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the dying fire. He was staring toward the window this time. I couldn't see anything outside. It was just blackness, but I could sense something off. I got up, grabbed the flashlight from the counter, and shined it through the window. The beam hit the wet glass and reflected back, blinding me for a moment. When my eyes adjusted, I caught a glimpse of something, a shape moving between the trees. It was too far to see clearly, but it wasn't an animal. It was tall. I froze for a moment, watching. The shape didn't move again. I told myself it might just be the light hitting the trees oddly, or my tired eyes playing tricks, but deep down I didn't believe that. I closed the curtains and sat by the door with Milo next to me. His breathing was slow, but his eyes never moved away from the window. For the next hour, I just listened. The rain eased up, but the dripping sound from the trees continued. Then, around 2:30, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, heavy ones, just outside the cabin. They stopped near the porch. Milo stood up and growled louder this time, teeth showing slightly. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I turned off the flashlight. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know exactly where I was sitting. I waited for what felt like forever. The footsteps didn't move. I didn't even hear breathing. I finally reached for the small hunting knife I kept in my bag, just in case. I didn't own a gun, and for the first time, I wished I had brought one. I sat completely still, trying not to make a sound. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, moving slowly away, fading into the distance. When morning came, I went outside. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soft and muddy. I walked around the cabin and saw clear footprints near the porch, human footprints. They were large, maybe size 11 or 12, and they went around the back of the cabin toward the woods. My stomach tightened as I followed them a little way. They led to the edge of the trees and then disappeared into the soft earth where the ground sloped downward. I looked around, scanning the forest. The air was cold, my breath coming out in faint clouds. Everything looked normal. The same trees, the same mist hanging low between them, but the silence felt wrong. I turned back quickly and decided I was leaving that morning, storm or not. I packed up fast. Milo stayed close to me the whole time, never wandering off like he usually did. When I started the truck, he jumped in immediately, which wasn't like him either. He usually took a minute to sniff around before we left anywhere. As I drove down the muddy road, I noticed something else. Near the side of the path, maybe 50 yards from the cabin, there was an old camping tarp half buried under wet leaves. I slowed down, staring at it. It looked like someone had been staying out there, maybe recently. I could see the outline of a small fire pit next to it, the ashes still dark and clumped. That image stuck with me the whole drive back to town. I didn't stop, didn't even turn on the radio. My hands were tight on the steering wheel. The entire time I kept thinking about how close that campsite had been to the cabin, and how long whoever had been there might have been watching. When I finally got back to town, I stopped at a small gas station to fill up and grab coffee. My phone finally caught a signal, and I checked the news out of habit. One headline caught my eye. It mentioned a local man being searched for after several reports of trespassing and attempted break-ins around that same area. The man had been living off the grid for months, possibly hiding in the woods. They hadn't caught him yet. I didn't say anything to anyone about what happened. I returned the cabin key a few days later and told the owner everything was fine, but I never went back there again. Sometimes at night, when I walk Milo outside, he'll stop and stare into the dark like he did that night, and I can still feel that same cold unease spread through my chest. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't my imagination. Someone had been out there in those woods, watching, waiting, maybe even planning something. And I knew that if I had stepped outside just a few minutes earlier, or if Milo hadn't warned me when he did, that night could have ended very differently. Since then, I've kept the knife closer when I travel. I double-check the locks even in the middle of nowhere. And sometimes, when I think back to that cabin, I can still picture those muddy footprints leading into the trees, fading into the dark where the rain had washed most of them away, but not all. It's enough to remind me that some things don't need to be supernatural to be terrifying. Some of the scariest things are simply real people, silent, patient, and far too close. It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to take a few days away from the city. I had been living in Manchester for almost 6 years, stuck in a dull job and tired of hearing the constant noise of traffic, sirens, and people. My mind felt heavy all the time, and I thought some time alone in the countryside would help clear it. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, only that I'd be gone for a week. I rented a small car and drove north, away from everything familiar. My plan was simple: find a quiet place, stay a few days, walk, read, and just be away from people. By late afternoon, I was deep in Cumbria, following a narrow, winding road that barely looked used. I didn't have an exact destination, just a direction. The road was lined with trees, thick and close together, the kind that made it feel like evening even though the sun hadn't set yet. My phone had lost signal miles back. Eventually, I saw a small dirt path leading off the road, half covered in grass. I stopped the car and looked at it. It wasn't marked, but something about it made me curious. It looked like it led deeper into the woods. I don't know why I turned down it, but I did. The path was rough and uneven. Branches brushed against the sides of the car, and the grass underneath was tall and dry. After about 5 minutes, I came out into a small clearing. That's when I saw it, a cabin. It was old, clearly abandoned, sitting slightly crooked on its foundation. The wood was dark from years of rain, and the roof sagged in places. The windows were dirty, one cracked, and the door hung unevenly on its frame. It looked like nobody had been there in decades. Still, it stood there quiet, alone. I parked the car and got out. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I walked closer to the cabin. The grass was high, and every step made a crunching sound. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like dust, wood, and something faintly metallic, maybe rust or old nails. The cabin was small, just one main room and a tiny space that must have been a kitchen. There was a broken table against the wall, an old iron stove, and a single wooden chair. The floorboards were warped and soft in some places. On one side was a narrow staircase that led to what looked like a loft or sleeping area. It was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. Felt like the air itself was watching. I decided to stay there for the night. I had sleeping gear in the car, a small camping stove, and enough food and water for a few days. I didn't see any signs of danger. No footprints, no tools, no fresh marks anywhere. It was obvious the place hadn't been used for a very long time. I cleaned a bit of space on the floor near the stove and set up my sleeping bag there. The temperature started to drop as the sun went down, and by night, the forest outside was pitch black. Lying there, I could hear everything: the creaking wood, the wind against the walls, and the soft sound of small animals moving outside. But around midnight, something started to feel wrong. It wasn't a sound that woke me up, but the feeling that something was nearby, the kind of tension that makes your stomach tighten. I listened carefully, trying to tell if it was just an animal. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps on the porch outside. They stopped near the door. I froze completely, barely breathing. My first thought was that maybe it was a hiker or someone lost, but there were no lights, no sound of a car, nothing. Just the steady sound of weight shifting on old wood. The door didn't open, but I could hear the faintest sound of someone's breathing, slow, uneven, like they were listening. It went on for maybe a minute, then nothing. Silence again. I didn't move for hours after that. My hand stayed near my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. When morning came, I looked outside. The porch had muddy footprints, bare feet. The prints led from the trees to the door and then back into the woods. I wanted to leave immediately, but something in me didn't. Maybe I convinced myself it was just a local passing through. Maybe someone drunk or lost. I stayed another night. That second day, I walked around the area. The forest stretched for miles. I found a narrow stream a short distance away, and nearby an old fence half fallen over. There were no houses, no roads, nothing human. Only that cabin. That evening, I made a small fire outside to cook. It was cold, and the sound of the crackling flames felt calming. As the sky darkened, I noticed something strange on the far edge of the clearing. An old well. I hadn't seen it before, hidden by weeds and overgrown grass. The wooden cover on top was broken, and when I looked inside, it was too dark to see the bottom. I dropped a small rock in, but there was no sound of it hitting anything. That night, I didn't sleep well. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again to noise. This time, not footsteps, but a scraping sound along the wall outside. It moved slowly from one side of the cabin to the other. The sound of nails or something metal dragging along the wood. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then the noise stopped. I waited, listening, for what felt like forever. Then, I heard a faint knock. Not on the door, but on the window above me. Just one soft tap. When morning came, I stepped outside and checked the walls. Along the wooden boards were long scratches, like something had been dragged there. I followed them around the side, and they led toward the forest, stopping near the well. I didn't look down into it again. By noon, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed my things and loaded the car as quickly as I could. Before I left, I took one last look at the cabin. In the daylight, it looked almost harmless again. Just an old structure falling apart in the woods. I almost felt stupid for being so scared. But when I started the car and began reversing, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A man was standing near the edge of the trees, half hidden by the branches. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. I stopped the car, staring at him through the mirror. He didn't step forward or turn his head. His clothes looked dirty, almost the same color as the trees behind him. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the outline of him. I didn't get out. I drove off down the dirt path as fast as I could. When I reached the main road, I finally stopped to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. I looked back once, but the path was hidden by the trees. I never told anyone about it. I don't even know what I saw, or if my mind had twisted what was real after being alone too long. But I know what I heard, the footsteps, the scratching, the knocking, and I know those bare footprints were real. 2 years later, while scrolling online, I came across a thread about abandoned places in Cumbria. Someone had posted a few photos of the same cabin. The comments said it had been torn down not long after. A local man mentioned that years ago, a hunter had lived there and disappeared. They never found him, only his clothes and some tools near an old well behind the cabin. I closed my laptop after reading that. I never went back. Sometimes, when I'm driving at night through quiet roads, I still think about that place. The sound of those slow footsteps on the porch. The feeling that someone was standing right outside the door, waiting. And the worst part is that deep down, I know whoever or whatever was there that night wasn't a ghost or my imagination. It was real. Someone still alive. Someone who had been living out there all along. It was late October of 2014, and the air in northern Montana had already started to carry that dry, biting cold that creeps into your bones. I had driven 6 hours from Billings to a remote hunting cabin that belonged to a friend's uncle. He had told me I could use it for a few days if I wanted to get away and hunt deer before the season closed. I didn't know the area well, but I'd hunted enough places alone to feel comfortable. The thought of a quiet week in the woods, away from people, sounded perfect. I needed a break. The cabin was an old single-room building made of dark, weathered logs that looked like they'd been standing there for 50 years. It sat deep in a patch of tall pines, about 2 miles from the dirt road where I parked my truck. I had to hike my gear in using a small trail that was barely visible under the fallen leaves and pine needles. There wasn't much inside the cabin, just a metal-framed cot, a wood stove, a small table, and a few rusty pots hanging from nails on the wall. There was no power, no signal, and the windows were coated with a thin film of dust and grime. Still, it felt sturdy enough to last the week. The first day went fine. I arrived just before sunset, unpacked my things, and lit a fire in the stove to warm the place up. The smell of burning pine filled the cabin, mixing with the faint odor of old wood and mouse droppings. I cooked a can of beans on the stove and ate quietly while listening to the fire crackle. When I stepped outside before bed, the woods were silent. No wind, no insects, no distant hum of cars. Just complete stillness. The stars looked almost too bright, like they were pressed closer than usual. That night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. The fire had burned out, and the inside of the cabin was freezing. I lay still under my blanket for a minute before realizing what woke me up. A faint, steady tapping sound came from somewhere outside, near the back wall. I thought maybe a branch was brushing against the cabin. I listened for a while and then it stopped. I figured it was just the wind or maybe an animal, and I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, when I stepped outside, I checked behind the cabin. There were no trees close enough for a branch to reach the wall, but I did notice something strange. A small pile of stones, maybe 6 or 7 of them, stacked neatly beside the door. They hadn't been there when I arrived. At first, I assumed it was something left behind by whoever stayed there last. It didn't seem worth thinking about. I spent the rest of that day hunting near a creek about a mile north of the cabin. The forest there was thick with brush and deadfall, and the ground was uneven. I didn't see much, just a few tracks, probably a day old. By the time I started heading back, the sun was already dropping behind the trees, turning everything a dull orange. When I reached the cabin, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it right away, but there was this heaviness in the air, like the silence was thicker than before. I noticed the door wasn't shut all the way. I was sure I had latched it when I left, but now it was slightly open. I pushed it in slowly and looked inside. Everything looked normal at first. My gear was still there, the firewood stacked by the stove was untouched. But then I saw it. Another small pile of stones, this time inside the cabin, right next to the table leg. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. It made no sense. No one else should have been out here. The nearest house was at least 10 miles away. I thought maybe an animal had dragged them in somehow, but that was ridiculous. Stones don't move themselves. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fire going and sat up on the cot with my rifle nearby, listening for any sound outside. The next morning, I checked the area around the cabin again. There were no tracks, no signs of anyone or anything. The ground was cold and hard, and even small prints should have shown. I started to feel uneasy. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but something in me wanted to stay. Maybe pride, maybe stupidity. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks because of the isolation. Later that day, I hiked further into the woods to check some traps I'd set near the ridge. The forest felt different, though. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant running water. Even the air felt heavier, like it was pressing against me. Around mid-afternoon, I found one of my traps had been sprung, but whatever got caught had torn itself free. The ground nearby was scuffed up, and there was a streak of dark blood leading into the brush. I followed it for a bit, but stopped after maybe 50 yards when I realized I was moving deeper into unfamiliar ground. The light was starting to fade, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. When I got back, I saw smoke coming from the chimney. My stove was burning, even though I hadn't lit it. I froze for a second. The sight didn't make sense. I moved slowly toward the door, my hand on my rifle. When I stepped inside, the fire was going strong, and the door was wide open. There was another stack of stones, this time right in the center of the room, taller than the others, about a foot high. That was the moment when something inside me flipped. I grabbed my backpack, shoved everything I could into it, and decided I was done. I didn't care if I left food or gear behind. I was leaving before it got dark. As I stepped outside, I noticed the sun was already setting fast. The trail back to the truck looked darker than it had that morning. I started walking quickly, keeping my eyes on the path. The forest around me felt alive, but not in a normal way. I could hear faint movements, distant but steady, like someone pacing through the trees parallel to me. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, but the sound would stop too. When I moved again, it would start again. I didn't run at first because I didn't want to trip or lose the trail, but by the time I was halfway to the road, I was nearly jogging. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my chest. The last half mile felt endless. The sound in the woods grew closer, heavier, like footsteps crunching leaves. I didn't look back. I just kept moving until I saw the faint glint of my truck through the trees. When I finally reached it, I threw my gear in the back and started the engine. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys. As the truck headlights cut through the trees, I caught one last glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A line of small stone piles along the edge of the trail, spaced evenly apart, leading all the way back toward the woods. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. That night, I stayed at a cheap motel in town and barely slept. My mind kept replaying everything, the stones, the fire, the sounds. I tried to make sense of it, but there wasn't a clear answer. Maybe someone had been living out there without anyone knowing, someone who didn't want visitors. Or maybe it was some kind of warning, a way of saying I was in the wrong place. A week later, when I told my friend about what happened, he said his uncle had stopped using that cabin years ago because things kept getting weird up there. He never explained what that meant, and I didn't ask. I never went back to find out. To this day, when I think about it, the part that stays with me isn't the stones or the sounds. It's the fire. Someone had to be close enough to light that fire while I was gone, close enough to know exactly when I'd be back. Whoever it was didn't try to harm me. They just made sure I knew I wasn't alone. And that was enough. It was the autumn of 1997 when I decided to build a small cabin out in the woods behind the town of Creighton, a quiet place in northern Oregon. I was 29 at the time, working construction jobs here and there, but mostly keeping to myself. I'd grown tired of apartment walls, the sound of traffic, and people always around. I wanted something quieter, something I could build with my own hands. There was a piece of land about 12 miles outside of town, overgrown and half forgotten. It had been part of an old logging route decades ago, but now it was just a muddy trail surrounded by thick pines and birch. I bought it cheap, spent the early fall cutting trees, clearing brush, and marking out where I wanted the cabin to be. My plan was simple. One room, a small wood stove, a cot, and a table. I didn't care about looks. I just wanted it solid and dry. By late October, the weather had turned. Days got shorter, and nights brought a heavy chill that sank into the ground. That week, the forecast said rain, heavy rain, and I knew I had to get the roof finished before it hit. I worked all day hauling lumber and hammering in the dull gray light. When the sky finally opened, it wasn't a drizzle. It was sheets of cold, pounding rain that came down so hard it stung my face. I was soaked through, but I wasn't stopping. I remember the sound of nails hitting wet wood, the steady thud echoing into the forest like hollow knocks. By dusk, I had the roof half done. My small generator buzzed in the background, giving me a bit of light from a work lamp. The rest of the woods were pitch black, the rain making a constant roar against the trees. Everything smelled like wet pine and fresh sawdust. The ground had turned to thick mud, and my boots made that deep sucking sound every time I moved. At some point, I realized how dark it had gotten. The lamp only lit a small circle around me. Beyond that, it was like standing at the edge of a black ocean. I kept working, though. I could hear the wind shifting through the trees, long moans mixed with the hiss of rain. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked and fell, echoing like a gunshot. Around 9 that night, the rain got worse. It came down in sideways bursts, and the wind pushed it under the half-built roof. My clothes clung to me, and my fingers were stiff from the cold. I decided to stop for the night and take shelter in what was already built. I had 3 walls and half a roof. It wasn't much, but it kept most of the rain off. I dragged my tools inside, covered them with a tarp, and sat down on an overturned bucket. That was when I started hearing things that didn't fit the storm. At first, I thought it was just the sound of rain shifting in the trees, but then it came again. A faint, uneven thump somewhere outside. Slow, deliberate, not like branches falling. I held still, trying to listen through the rain. Another thump, then a pause, then 2 more, closer this time. It didn't sound like footsteps exactly, but it was heavy, slow, and distinct. I told myself it was an animal. Could have been a deer or maybe a black bear, but it felt strange, the pacing of it. It stopped every few seconds, like it was listening. The woods have their own sounds, but this wasn't like that. It had rhythm, like something thinking about its next step. I waited there for a few minutes, listening. Then it went quiet again, completely, just rain and wind. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired. I unrolled my sleeping bag, laid it on the floorboards, and pulled off my wet boots. The rain hit the roof in waves, loud enough to drown out everything else. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember was waking up to a faint scraping sound. It was soft, slow, like something dragging across wood. I opened my eyes, but it was pitch dark except for a dull glow from the work lamp, which was running low on fuel. The sound was right outside the cabin wall, not close to the door on the side. Something was brushing against the unfinished boards. Then another scrape, then nothing. I sat up, heart pounding hard enough I could feel it in my neck. The air smelled like wet dirt and old pine. The rain had eased a bit, but it was still coming down steady. I waited for a few minutes, not moving, just staring into the dark. My hammer was lying next to my pack, and I grabbed it without making a sound. The scraping didn't come back, but after a few minutes, I heard something else. Soft crunches in the mud, slow and irregular, circling the cabin. I crouched there, trying to listen over the rain. It wasn't the wind. I could tell the difference. Whatever it was close, 10, maybe 15 feet away. I couldn't see anything outside because the lamp's light didn't reach past the doorway. My first thought was maybe someone had wandered off the old logging trail and saw my light. But who'd be out here in a storm like this? The nearest road was miles away. After a few minutes, the sounds faded again. I waited longer, but nothing came back. My body eventually relaxed, though I never really felt safe again that night. I stayed awake, watching the rain slide down the boards, waiting for dawn. By morning, the storm had passed. The woods were dripping and gray, mist hanging between the trees. I stepped outside, my boots sinking deep in the mud. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. I walked around the cabin, checking the ground. There were marks in the mud. Not footprints exactly, but strange, uneven impressions. like someone had been walking barefoot but dragging one side. The trail went around the cabin and led off toward the trees. I followed it a few yards before it disappeared into the wet brush. I didn't stay long after that. I packed my things, locked up my tools, and hiked back to my truck. The drive into town felt longer than usual, every mile stretching out. I kept thinking about those sounds, about the pattern of the steps and the dragging noise. Maybe it was an animal with an injury. Maybe someone lost, wandering through the storm. I tried to believe that. But the next day, when I went back to check the site, I noticed something else. The tarp I'd left over the tools was pulled back, not torn or blown by wind, pulled back neatly. My hammer was gone. Nothing else, just that. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty space on the ground, listening to the forest. Everything was quiet. I kept working for another week, but I never stayed after sunset again. The woods felt different now, like they were holding their breath. I built the rest of the cabin as fast as I could. Turned out solid, small but sturdy. When I was done, I sold the land and walked away from it. A few years later, someone bought the place to use as a hunting cabin. I ran into him once at a hardware store in Creighton. He said the cabin was still standing strong, but he'd stopped spending nights there after something strange happened during a storm. He didn't go into detail, and I didn't ask. I just nodded, paid for my supplies, and left. Now, decades later, I still remember that night like it was yesterday. The sound of the rain, the dragging footsteps circling the cabin, the missing hammer. I've built dozens of cabins and houses since then, but none of them ever felt as quiet or as alive as that one in the woods. And every time I hear heavy rain hit a roof, I think about that night, about what was out there in the dark, moving slow through the mud, watching me work. I never found out what it was, and I never went back. But sometimes I wonder if that hammer's still lying somewhere in those woods, rusting under the dirt, waiting for the next person who thinks building a small cabin in the middle of nowhere is a peaceful idea. It was late October of 1996 when I decided to spend a few days alone at my uncle's old cabin, which sat right next to a forgotten graveyard on the edge of a small Pennsylvania town. I was 28 at the time, working in construction, and I wanted a quiet place to get away from the noise of the city and the constant ringing of machines. My uncle had passed away a few years earlier, and the property had been left to me. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but I still remembered the uneven dirt road that wound up the hill, the rusted metal gate that leaned to one side, and that eerie silence that seemed to hang around the place no matter the season. When I arrived, the sun was setting behind the trees. The air smelled damp, mixed with the sharp scent of decaying leaves and old wood. The cabin stood crooked against the fading light, the windows clouded with dust and grime, the porch sagging slightly in the middle. To the left of it, separated by a low stone wall that had started to crumble, was the graveyard. There couldn't have been more than 20 headstones in total, most of them so weathered you couldn't make out the names anymore. Some were tilted, some had fallen over completely, and a few were half covered by the earth itself. It was the kind of sight that made you instinctively quiet down without knowing why. I parked the truck and unloaded my bag, trying not to look at the graveyard for too long. The trees around it were bare, their branches reaching over the graves like claws, and the wind moving through them made a hollow whistling sound. I unlocked the cabin door, which stuck halfway before giving in with a groan. Inside smelled like mildew and cold air. There was a stone fireplace on one side, a single wooden table in the middle, and a few shelves against the wall, lined with dusty jars and tools. The bed in the corner was covered with a moth-eaten blanket. It was a simple place, rough but quiet, exactly what I thought I needed. The first night was uneventful. I built a small fire, heated up a can of soup, and sat by the window looking out at the graveyard. The moonlight was faint, barely enough to see the tops of the headstones. Every so often, the wind would move through the trees and make them creak. I noticed one grave near the wall that had a small pile of stones beside it, like someone had been stacking them recently. I figured it was just kids messing around, or maybe animals. Either way, it didn't matter much to me then. The next morning, the air was heavy with fog. It rolled down from the trees and sat low across the ground. I stepped outside with my coffee, boots crunching on the wet leaves, and looked over the graveyard wall. The fog made everything look closer than it really was. The stones seemed to float. That same pile of rocks was still there, though now it looked slightly different, taller, maybe. I brushed it off, thinking I must have just misremembered it. I spent the day cleaning up inside the cabin. There was old furniture pushed into corners, a few rusted tools, and a pile of wood that had gone soft from dampness. I found some of my uncle's old things too. A cracked lantern, a worn-out notebook with lists of repairs and supplies he never got around to. It was strange going through his things alone. The longer I stayed there, the more I felt like I was intruding in a place that didn't want to be opened again. By the second night, I started noticing things that made me uneasy. It wasn't anything dramatic, just small, quiet details that built up slowly. When I went to get more wood from the stack behind the cabin, I saw faint footprints in the mud near the graveyard wall. They weren't fresh, but they also weren't mine. The size looked too small for a man's boots, more like bare feet, pressed deep into the soft ground. They led toward the pile of rocks and stopped there. I stood staring for a while, trying to come up with some explanation. Maybe they were old, or maybe I was just seeing patterns in the mud. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been there recently. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound stood out. The shifting of wood, the wind against the windows, even the crackling of the fire. At one point, I thought I heard something faint coming from outside, like stones clicking together. I sat up, listening hard, but it stopped as soon as I focused on it. I told myself it was just the firewood shifting or maybe a raccoon knocking something over. I eventually fell asleep close to dawn, the fire almost out. The next morning, I went outside and saw that the pile of rocks near the graveyard had been knocked over. Some stones were scattered on the grass, others lying against the wall. It looked like someone had kicked it apart during the night. That uneasy feeling in my gut turned into something heavier. I checked around the property. No sign of tracks this time, no sign of anyone. Everything was quiet again, too quiet. Even the birds seemed to be avoiding the place. I spent that afternoon cutting wood to keep myself busy. The sun came through the trees in thin lines, and for a while it almost felt normal again. When I finished, I went to wash my hands near the old rain barrel behind the cabin. That's when I noticed something else. A small piece of torn fabric caught on one of the branches near the graveyard wall. It looked like part of a shirt, faded and dirty. I didn't recognize it, but it didn't look that old either. By the third night, the wind had picked up. The cabin groaned every few minutes, and the trees outside clattered against each other. I had the fire going strong, but I couldn't shake that restless feeling. Around midnight, I heard it again, that clicking sound, like someone stacking stones carefully, one by one. I didn't move for a while. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I finally stood up and went to the window. The moonlight made the graveyard faintly visible. I stared hard but couldn't see anything moving. Then I noticed something strange. The pile of rocks was back, taller than before. I hadn't rebuilt it. No one should have been there. I froze for a long time, watching. Nothing else happened. After maybe an hour, I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. When morning came, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my bag, ready to leave before noon. I stepped outside and stopped dead. The ground near the cabin door was disturbed, as if someone had been digging. The dirt was loose and dark, piled up in a small mound. I looked closer and saw more piles, small, uneven holes near the edge of the graveyard, like someone had been trying to uncover something. I walked slowly over to the wall and stared at the nearest grave. The stones that had been stacked now formed a line, leading straight to the side of the cabin. I felt sick looking at it. I didn't wait around to think it through. I threw my things in the truck, started it up, and drove down that dirt road faster than I should have. I didn't look back, not once. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw, not right away. It took me months before I went back there, and even then, it was with 2 others from town. The cabin was still standing, though the roof had caved in slightly. The graveyard was the same, except for one thing. The ground near the wall was fresh, as if someone had filled in a hole recently. There were no stones stacked anywhere. Later, one of the locals told me that years ago, before my uncle bought the place, that land had belonged to a man who buried his family there himself. No records, no markers, just stones to remember them by. Over time, the graves had been lost under the soil and trees. My uncle probably never knew. Sometimes, when I think back to those nights, I can still hear the faint sound of stones clicking together, slow and steady, like someone trying to rebuild what had been disturbed. I've never gone back since. The property still belongs to me, but I leave it alone. I think some places are meant to stay that way, quiet, untouched, forgotten by everyone except the ones still buried underneath.